The Macomber Cube is one of the expansions that is a part of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. And so with it, the Macomber Cube is aiming to provide for a three-dimensional representation. And in this representation, what we want to do is add various dimensions to help cover the traditional confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. And with this, what we want to do is ensure that we incorporate appropriate aspects that can deal with transmission, storage, and processing. And so with this in mind, we want to ensure that we're addressing appropriate security aspects. And so a good example of this is ensuring that confidentiality is available within the transmission of data. And so this can occur through issuing technology, policy, and procedures and appropriate educational training. Examining the policy and procedure aspects of the confidentiality of data and transmission helps to ensure that this can occur in a proper manner. And so we want to keep in mind that the Macomber triad involves an understanding of appropriate policies and practices that can ensure that an organization is protected. One important term to consider is non-repudiation, and when it comes to information security. And so this is the idea that we can provide assurance that an individual cannot deny having digitally signed a document or been party to a transaction. So this is considered more of a legal concept related to the total of evidence that can be presented. And so with this in mind, we also have to consider the integrity tenet. And so integrity is an important part of information security. Integrity is going to ensure that information has not been improperly changed or mishandled. So this means that in order for data to change in any way, that it must be approved and go through an appropriate process that denotes that the approval and documents the changes that have occurred. So there are many ways in which this can be done to ensure that the data is protected appropriately. So in many ways, operating systems and other file systems allow for specific permissions to be set. And so this is pretty straightforward in that it allows for containers to reside within appropriate structures on the server. And so how do we ensure that integrity is maintained? If we have appropriate users, such as user A and user B that are going to access a system, they're going to access the server and then they'll have to log in appropriately. Their credentials are then going to be checked against an appropriate database management system. And if those credentials are verified, then they will have access to appropriate data that has been secured. And so this allows for an application to allow for access to data only if a user has appropriate permissions that are in place. So this means that we want to ensure that the user has access only if allowed. This can be done using encryption to ensure that the integrity of the user login information is maintained. And encryption can also be utilized in order to protect data. And this allows for protection from being viewed or changed by unauthorized users. And so with this integrity tenet in place, what we have here is we can have that users are going to access a system and their credentials are going to be verified. And if approved, they will be able to gain the access to the system. And so with this in mind, we can see that user A has a different set of permissions, or we can assume that they do, and that user A could access and possibly change information that is contained within the system, while user B might only be allowed to simply retrieve that data. And this is what ensures that the integrity tenet is maintained. And so what do we mean when we talk about governance? We want to keep in mind that governance is a concept that relates to a specific set of actions within an organization. And this can help to ensure compliance, and compliance can occur between policies, processes, standards, and appropriate guidelines. And so governance allows for appropriate business requirements to be met and ensures that established rules are maintained. And so governance allows for organization to achieve the business goals. And good governance is going to focus on making sure that the tenets of the business and the goals of the business are understood and kept in mind. With this understanding, we want to consider that governance relates to a collection of components. And these components have checkpoints that have to be controlled and maintained and performed. And so we can have quality assurance and we can have quality control. Within this understanding of governance, we want to ensure that each one is maintained. And so when we say quality assurance, we're focusing on being able to provide preventative measures for control. And so what QA is going to do is it's going to ensure that mistakes do not occur, while quality control is going to be in place to act as a detective control. So with this in mind, what we consider is that quality control is going to be used in order to improve the quality over time, which allows for fewer mistakes to occur in the future because we're able to learn from our past mistakes. And so with this in mind, we can think of this from the perspective that we can have appropriate mechanisms in place to help us see the forests and the trees as well. And so with this, governance is important because it includes various oversight processes and committees that can be utilized in order to help maintain control. And so overall, there are some important things that we need to keep in mind and why governance is important. Firstly, it's going to provide assurance and confidence that rules are being followed. It ensures that senior management needs to know that business objectives are being met. So what if those objectives are not being met? We want to ensure that all of the rules that are outlined within the organization are being followed appropriately by all users. And this can mean that we have assurance that is in place to ensure that deliverable values are promised. We want to ensure that senior management knows how to properly invest in the organization and ensure that things are being managed appropriately and properly. We also want to ensure that regulators are able to look at the structure of the organization for insurance. And if there are any risks to shareholders or customers, then we can properly manage them. And we want to have effective governance in place to ensure that quality assurance and quality control are a part of the culture within the organization. And this is important because the culture of the organization has a direct impact on the information assurance and information security. If the organization embraces appropriate mechanisms for quality assurance and quality control, then security is bound to improve. It also is important that we provide governance in regards to configuration management processes as well. And so it's also important to keep in mind that there are also various information security policies that we need to maintain. And so when we think about information system security policies, we want to ensure that we have a framework, and this can be a collection of several documents that are going to provide for a set of principles that allows for the organization to effectively understand and detail appropriate communication policies. So what exactly does that mean? Well, information system security policies are going to need to be able to cover appropriate threats that are going to occur in the system. What are these threats? Well, they can include making sure that people are protected, that appropriate organizational information is protected, as well as the physical assets are protected as well. And so there can be different policies in place that are going to come together to help enforce appropriate organizational security standards. And with this in mind, we can have appropriate documents in place to create appropriate framework. And the policy framework is going to consist of a number of different documents that that will combine to create the framework. And so the first of these types of documents are going to be related to principles, policy, and standard. So we'll have principles in place, and the principles are going to be there in order to help us establish the tone, and it allows for the top stakeholders to be ensured that authority is given to them so that the policies are enforced. And so the policies are going to, of course, be in place to help provide uh, and define the actions of the organization when it comes to conducting business as well as transactions. Then we're also going to have appropriate standards in place. The standards are going to be in place to help establish appropriate methods within the organization as well. The remaining three components associated with the information security policy framework is going to be procedures. Procedures are going to provide the steps that are going to be required to implement an appropriate process. And then we'll also have appropriate parameters. Parameters are going to be in place in order to help a policy, standard, or procedure to be suggested. Then we're going to have appropriate definitions, and the definitions are going to be used in the policy documents in order to define specific terms. The definitions are in place so that any policy documents can be interpreted appropriately and correctly. And so there's important things to consider in that different verbiage exists, and these 6 documents can be all referred to as security policies or security policy frameworks as well. So we can further discuss how these policies are interrelated or relate to one another. And with this in mind, we have to consider that we have internal and external documents that are available. And so with the internal documents, we can have our 5 internal documents being represented as principles, policy, definitions, procedure, as well as guidelines. And then external can be appropriate standards that can be viewed. And so a standard is going to be, of course, is going to be represented as a set of, as a process or a standardized method that can be used by the organization in order to implement a solution. And so standards can vary. And so we have Differences between policies and standards and procedures. And really, we can see policies and standards differ in that policies implement controls on a system, and they can be used in order to make it a compliant to a standard. And then what is a standard? Standards are in place to help influence the creation of policies. They, they often can be used in order to determine a minimum requirement, but can be very detailed in nature. And often they can start with industry norms. So how do policies and procedures differ? Well, policies are requirements placed on processes. And then we'll also have procedures. And procedures are going to be the technical steps that are taken in order to achieve policy goals. And so this can occur on a step-by-step basis. They can contain the appropriate instructions on the performance of a task. They can also be used to identify how to respond to an incident. And so it's also important to keep in mind that policy principle documents are going to be in place in order to help standardize communication. And so these are going to provide general rules that can cut across the entire organization. And so these principles can be written in plain English and also focus on key risks or behaviors. And it can be used to describe how senior executives can express goals and as well as objectives. And it's also important to keep in mind that policies are often approved by the most senior levels of management. And so a procedure or guideline is going to be approved by a lower level management responsible for implementing such policies. So creating policies is going to be a key part of information systems security within an organization. And so creating policies uh, can be executed in a very effective manner. And so previously we mentioned COBIT and other tools that can be used in order to create appropriate policies. Also ISO, which stands for the International Standards Organization, created a standard ISO called 17799. And this is the information technology, security techniques, and code of practice for information security management. It can be used in order to establish best practices of control objectives and control, and as well as it can be used in order to create appropriate security policies. We also have the National Institute of Standards and Technology policy, and it's called 800-12. And it provides an introduction to information security. We'll focus a little bit more on that in chapter 5. And then we also have the SANS organization, which has a number of templates that can be utilized in order to create appropriate policies for review. So this provides us with a number of different policies that can be utilized within developing our information security policy framework. And the key in ensuring that these are most helpful is ensuring that we have appropriate mechanisms in place that are able to be easily followed and that are standardized as well. And so as policies become more complex, these standards continue to evolve with them as well.